We here at WKAR exist to serve Mid-Michigan with trusted journalism and local programming. Federal funding has been eliminated, which means community support is critical to sustaining this service and helping WKAR meet evolving community needs. Your ongoing support ensures public media remains freely available and locally focused. Become a sustaining member or upgrade your current gift today. Sustain what matters. Build what's next.
Who's on first? The latest statewide survey results on the race for governor and the U.S. Senate Democratic primary with political pollster Richard Zuba. So sit in with us as we get the inside out. Off the record.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Bellwether Public Relations, a full-service strategic communications agency partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and issue advocacy. Learn more at bellwetherpr.com. And now, this edition of Off the Record with Tim Skubic.
Thanks very much for tuning in for Off the Record. New polling data is out in the race for governor and the U.S. Senate primary, and our guest is now featured in this brilliant piece of journalism. Let's take a look, okay?
In the Democratic primary for governor, Jocelyn Benson has a strong lead. She's at 66%, while Genesee County Sheriff Chris Swanson is at 8%. With 26% undecided. There is also some major churn in the Republican side of the gubernatorial race primary-wise. A couple of weeks ago, Perry Johnson was basically tied with John James, but not anymore. According to Detroit Chamber of Commerce pollster Richard Zuba, Mr. James is now at 37%. Mr. Johnson, despite spending millions of dollars on TV advertising, has moved to 20%. So what's going on here?
John James has run for office multiple times statewide. He has a relationship with Republican primary voters already. These are the hardcore of the hardcore Republicans. So he has a relationship with them. Perry Johnson is just developing that relationship with them.
In third place in the GOP primary for governor, Mike Cox, 10%, Eric Nesbitt, 7%, and Ralph Rebant at 1%, with 23% undecided. Several weeks ago, in the Democratic U.S. Senate primary, Abdul El-Sayed was basically tied with Mallory McMorrow. But now, Haley Stevens has moved into a statistical dead heat with Mr. El-Sayed. Mr. Zuba sees two different lanes for winning this primary, starting with Ms. Stevens.
She is leading by more than 20 points in Macomb, Oakland, and West Wayne. Abdul El-Sayed, very clear pathways for him also. Democratic socialists. Mallory McMorrow, she's running this strategy where she's trying to straddle the two lanes.
Michigan voters will figure all this stuff out as they pick the winners and losers on August 4th.
All right, so those are the numbers, Jordan. What did you make of them?
Frankly, what stood out to me most was the level of enthusiasm that Democrats and Republicans both reported in terms of being excited to vote. This is going to be an intensely watched and intensely observed primary. And it's interesting to me to see that voters are, again, I know that these are, as Sheba talked about, some of the primary voters, these are your most politically informed, but you're seeing people who are really tapped in very early in this race. And that means that things could probably get pretty ugly, frankly, as we move closer to the election.
Yeah, and it also, I'm looking at the comparison between what's going on in that race and what's going on with our economy in this kind of seesaw. One day the market's up, one day the market's down, one day gas prices are up, one day gas prices are coming down a little bit. I won't say all the way down. There just seems to be this unsettled territory. And I think Americans right now and Michiganders are saying, what in the world is going on? And I think they're shifting all over. And I think there's a long time between now and August and what they're going to do.
Yeah, we got these big primaries to kind of sort out before we start really kind of dissecting what actually is going to happen in these big picture economic issues in the general election. And we're doing this while there's $5 gas on the street right now, essentially. But in the governor's race, John James holds a 17-point lead over Perry Johnson after Perry Johnson has spent at least $10 million on television, phones, billboards, all kinds of advertising money can buy essentially, and he's still down 17 points. It's quite a gap. against a candidate who is doing very little campaigning, skipping debates, essentially really kind of like dodging media in general. John James is pretty, sort of still in the bunker, as they say, from the Biden campaign of 2020, and so
in the basement,
still in the basement essentially, but he's still got this comfortable lead. But there's 2-3 crucial months ahead here, and that very well could be eroded.
But let me piggyback on that point. Does that prove or not prove that him not showing up at debates has had zero impact on this vote?
No, I mean, I think that, Richard hit it straight on the head, though. James is somebody with statewide name recognition already. He's run in several statewide elections. He's lost in several statewide elections, too. But, I mean, to the average voter, you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody who could name, the governor, secretary of state, and attorney general, and they've been in those positions for about 8 years. The fact that John James has name recognition with people is not all that crazy to me. It's how he's going to use that capital moving forward. And to the point someone made online, I actually believe it was former Michigan Republican Party co-chair Michon Maddock. She noted that James has agreed to 2 debates, but they're in July. Absentee ballots start going out, I believe, in June. So there ostensibly will be Republicans who vote before ever hearing from James on a debate stage, which should be troubling, frankly, if you are that candidate. How do you know that those weren't voters you could have convinced earlier on in the game if you had gotten out there? It's, again, repeating the past mistakes of prior campaigns.
Well, James is smart to protect his lead politically. Why get into the middle of this fray until you absolutely have to? Because at some point, the attacks are going to come, and he's going to have to defend himself. So hold on as long as you can, and hopefully you'll be the front runner. And by the time you get into it, no matter what damage is done, you still remain the front runner. But the big question mark in all this is, what does President Donald Trump do? Does he get in this? Does he stay out? And does he endorse anybody at this time? Because all of them would love to be able to have his endorsement in the primary. Now, it may come back and backfire on you in the general, but for the primary,
first things first,
those things are important.
Well, and I was just going to note, too, that as part of that polling, we were discussing support for President Trump amongst young voters were noted to be down. So, you bring up Trump. If you are in, first of all, this is going to be obviously a very interesting race because you still have to put in the Duggan factor of who's he going to draw from, what's going to go on there. So you need to get every voter you can. If Trump throws himself in the race and you're seeing that he's losing support amongst young people who are not super stoked about what's going on in Iraq right now, let alone the fact that gas is pretty much $5 a gallon. I drove in today with $4.99 right on my street corner. Will the Trump effect actually be a net positive? His approval rating is incredibly down, and to say nothing of the economic factors that are at play here in Michigan.
Well, as far as the Perry Johnson camp is concerned, their $10 million bought them from 0 to 20%, okay, which is the good news for them. The bad news, he's still 17 points behind, and how do you make that up?
Well, you're going to have to keep spending. He'll probably spend $10 million more easily in the next couple months, and maybe even more than that in July. To pivot to the Senate race, I mean, this is America's.
I was looking for a segue. You bailed me out.
This is America's best Democratic primary all across the country. This is a really fascinating race, and really it is underscoring this huge divide in the Democratic Party over Israel. You got the pro-Israel candidate in Haley Stevens. She'll take AIPAC money, and she will not apologize for it. And then you got the anti-Israel, pro-Palestine candidate in Abdullah Sayed, and then right in the middle is Mallory McMorrow, trying to sort of find a different lane between the two of them. But there may not be another lane. Right now there appears to be 2 lanes. You're either with Israel or you're against Israel. You're with Palestine or against Palestine. And it showed up in that Democratic convention with this vote with all these delegates.
But Chad, be careful. That Democratic convention was not a slice of Americana.
I know it wasn't.
Okay, well, so be careful about generalization of what we saw there, which was dramatic. There's no question about it.
Put aside. We know we know because we have the results now that 2/3 of the delegates voted for Amira Makhled, the Dearborn attorney who represented protesters at the University of Michigan in this U of M regent's race and ran out, incumbent regent Jordan Acker, a Jewish Democrat.
The regular Democrats from the governor on down.
Yes, he had the establishment, and the establishment is now, kind of licking its wounds a little bit. But they don't really know how to handle this situation. This is showing up more and more. And so Stevens is plowing forward, and probably the best thing going for Stevens is Mallory McMorrow in the race, because she's going to pick off a number of people in the middle and maybe leave just enough narrow of enough lane for her to win this nomination.
But you got this interesting battle between what's happening in terms of foreign affairs and what's going on in the Middle East, which certainly is a volatile situation, and then, of course, what's happening at home in terms of the economy and the pocketbook issues, and which one is going to have the biggest effect on voters come August. It's a big question mark. We don't know, but I think you're absolutely right in terms of the analysis right now.
It tilts towards the domestic turmoil that we're in?
Normally it does, and normally foreign affairs doesn't have that much weight on how people vote. But I think Chad and Jordan are absolutely right. What's going on in the Middle East right now is it's leading the headlines almost every day in one form or another. It's affecting the gasoline prices. It's affecting domestic issues and pocketbook issues in a way that normally it doesn't. So it's all sort of tied together, and I'm not sure how it's going to shake out.
And you talk about that middle lane that McMorrow occupies. I think what will be most interesting to watch is this. Especially, we're seeing these attacks come out about McMorrow. There was the release this week that she had a bunch of deleted tweets where she was, quote unquote, trashing Michigan, which I would frankly argue as a born and raised Michigander, complaining about the weather is maybe some of the most Michigan thing you can do. But it'll be interesting to see, should she flame out, and it does become between El Said and Stevens, that where her voters go, because you've seen El Said and McMorrow kind of buddy up. They don't like Stevens. Their constituency isn't the biggest fan of Stevens, and a lot of that does have to do with where she stands on the Israel stuff. So will those McMorrow voters, will more of them come over to the Abdul El Said side? Will that be enough to swing him over the Stevens for nomination? It remains to be seen, but I don't think that it's something that should go ignored.
To Chuck's point, if we have a ceasefire that ends and Israel just starts bombing the heck out of Lebanon, Abdul El Said is going to use the imagery of this to say they're going to do to Lebanon what they did to Gaza, and he will use this to motivate voters in this primary, and it's going to be hard for Stevens to try to counter that if at the same time it's inflaming all this other regional war with Iran. I mean, anything could go wrong here, and then add to the fuel prices, add to the angst. I mean, all this could just kind of stir up, and add to the elements of what's going to be on the minds of voters as they head to the polls in this primary. And then you're going to have a different ball game in the fall against Mike Rogers. If you get Haley Stevens versus Mike Rogers, it's basically sort of AIPAC versus AIPAC, essentially a candidate. And if you get Al Sayed or McMorrow, you're going to have a much different contrast.
Quickly, let's come back to a domestic issue. The Speaker, the House unveiled what we know is his property tax relief plan. The state Senate moving on the budget. There's movement there. It looks pretty good. This property tax thing, what's your early read as to where that goes?
Well, the House Speaker Matt Hall wants to tie it to the budget negotiation process. And as we've seen in the past, House Speaker Matt Hall has more often than not, when he says especially bigger ticket items that he wants to get something, he finds sometimes a way to get at least a portion of what he wants. I know I'm doing a lot of couching there, but he is a negotiator. He is good at that. We've seen that historically. Whether or not it goes anywhere, I'm really gonna hold off on that. There doesn't seem to be a ton of appetite in the Senate. We haven't seen a level of buy-in or support from the governor on that specific plan. She's floated her own property tax relief plan for seniors. So my gut check, it's not going anywhere right now, and even in the House, they're out for the next week.
Just hold on. You can be for property tax cuts all you want, But Matt Hall's plan calls for a massive replacement tax and tax on services. And yet they haven't.
To the tune of $4 billion.
$4 billion.
In luxury taxes.
Well, there are not enough luxuries.
Well, that's what we're about to find out. Look, give him credit on this. He announced in the news conference he's going to go to the governor's Treasury Department and run the numbers to see if private plane sales tax will raise X amount of dollars. If he can't get to $4 billion, he's got to punt.
I mean, the data is already publicly available. Reporters have looked at this. There are not enough DeVos family jets to possibly tax to go after this. It ain't going to work. And so you're going to have to start going down the line of taxes, and they're going to hit sales tax. They're going to hit sales tax on services the middle class uses every day.
Well, then they're dead.
Well,
Okay, because that's not going to fly.
It'll go the way of baby shoe bronzing in this town, and so
going back to the Jennifer Granholm administration.
And so it will not work. It will blow up, and his members will be running for the hills, particularly members who are in vulnerable districts in Oakland, Macomb, and downriver Wayne County.
And what I was just trying to say about the legislation itself, though, is that it doesn't even properly define what it's hoping to seek out taxes for. The people who are reviewing the bills right now even say that negotiations are ongoing, and they've been kept intentionally vague on purpose, because what they're even attempting to do, they're still trying to figure out.
It's a moving target.
They introduced an empty shell of a bill that can be filled in at the last hour. And we've seen these tricks before in this town, and this is what the speaker's up to right now.
Yeah. Chuck, quickly.
And there may be a little bit movement on it in some camaraderie. You've heard Mayor Sheffield talk about the need to do something about property taxes. She talked about it in her State of the City address. It's an issue that Detroiters are very concerned with, especially senior citizens. Whether or not they can craft something that the D's will go with the R's is the big question mark, but people are very concerned.
All right, let's
about
call in our pollster,
tax.
veteran pollster. Richard, nice to have you on Off the Record. If I can see your face, there you are. Welcome back. It's nice to see you. So you've heard our conversation here on the domestic versus the foreign stuff. Weigh it in.
It's not even close, folks. This is going to be decided on the economy. Plain and simple. We asked this question, particularly in both of the primary surveys. What's the most important issue facing Michigan? There was not one respondent in that Democratic survey that said Gaza, Israel, or the Middle East. It is about prices and affordability. Clear and simple. This is not even close. And I think we need to step back here for a second. And this is probably something operatives across the state need to hear. Last year we did polling asking people, where do they get their information? What social platforms are they on? Only 18% of the state said they are even on Twitter, and only 4% said they use Twitter a lot. And I think there's a whole lot of people who think campaigns are won and lost on Twitter, and that's not the case. You win and lose primary elections by talking to older voters who dominate the August primary. And right now they care about costs.
Jordan.
Earlier I had mentioned the concept of the Duggan effect. We see Republicans and Democrats equally motivated to get out and vote this primary election. We're assuming it goes on to the general. Mike Duggan will not have to run in the primary election. But, how much do you anticipate Duggan pulling away from either of those? Did you poll in any of that in terms of how Republicans or Democratic voters were feeling about him as an entity in this race?
So we did not include Mike Duggan in the primary election polls. We've included Mike Duggan in past general election polls. And what we saw was he was essentially drawing equally from both parties. But I raised, my doubts about this at the time. This election is very much going to be a referendum on the incumbent president, as all midterms are. And I have to say, Donald Trump's numbers are absolutely collapsing in Michigan. Independents have absolutely abandoned any support they have for Donald Trump. I think we're going to see it get worse before it gets better. So my question has always been, on a referendum of Donald Trump, do voters simply go back to the corners they were in? Do the Democrats galvanize their supporters, I've always said Jocelyn Benson has the easiest path here, and that is to win those voters who strongly disapprove of Donald Trump. And the question I have moving forward is, do those party members go back to their parties?
So, Mr. Schubert, do Republicans running in Michigan really want the Donald Trump president endorsement, or are they just saying they want it because they don't want to offend him, but quietly they want him to stay the heck out of the race?
Well, we saw what this did in 2018 for Bill Schuette. He did everything he could to get that endorsement and became an albatross around his neck in the general election. This is going to be no different for any Republican running, that they've got to figure out a way after August 4th to pivot to independent voters who, I will say, deeply, deeply disapprove of President Trump right now. And it all revolves around costs. And we're seeing it get drastically worse because, as you all talked about, gas prices are skyrocketing in Michigan. So this is an ongoing problem of the Trump era. You do great in primaries with Donald Trump's endorsement, but boy, independents don't take to that endorsement.
Richard, in the Democratic Senate primary, what is motivating these voters? Is it on these candidates in particular? Is it economic issues? Is it foreign policy, or is it just vibes?
Well, again, in this race in particular, I think there's a lot of political operatives who think Twitter matters, and it doesn't. You can have all the hissy fits and mean girl tweets on Twitter you want, but voters who dominate this election are older voters, and they're not paying attention to you. You're just talking to yourselves. But I do think this is an interesting situation. We saw this, convention, Democratic convention. What a terrible way to select nominees, frankly, to just, stack conventions with people from Washtenaw County. And it does not reflect the rest of the state. And as I mentioned earlier, that convention, those delegates are deeply out of step with the older voters who are going to dominate the primary election in August. They care about, costs. They care about the economy. That is their primary motivation. I found it very interesting that Haley Stevens seems to be dominating those over 65 voters right now. That's very, this is methodical campaigning we're seeing. And it's not flashy, but it's the blocking and tackling that helps you win. Abdul El-Sayed has a whole lot of excitement amongst younger voters. We saw those events at Michigan State and U of M. But I got news for that campaign. There's not going to be anybody on campus at MSU and U of M on August 4th. You've got to be talking to older voters to win this thing.
Historically, the party not in power doesn't do well in the midterms. But with the recent Supreme Court decision, trickling away at voting rights, will that perhaps not be good for the Democratic Party as they start redistricting all over the map?
Well, I certainly, I for one am stunned to see that Louisiana just is going to postpone an election. Everything the Democrats have been saying about playing with elections, tinkering with elections is coming home to roost, because very much postponing an election is a really, truly dramatic step. And it's over partisan advantage. I think that should worry everybody in the country that something like that is taking place. Here in Michigan, we have a bit of a buffer in the redistricting commission. And while it may not help Democrats, it may not help Republicans, boy, it sure does help democracy right now. And, Michigan is example, perhaps, for the rest of the country. I just don't think the rest of the country is going to follow the example.
Richard, what's your take on the young men, the angry young men who voted for Donald Trump? They couldn't vote enough times for him. Where are they going?
We are now seeing, not just in this Republican primary survey, but in surveys I've been doing for the last several months, Donald Trump appears to be developing quite a problem with younger voters, particularly those younger Republicans and independents who put him in office. They don't like what's going on at all, and it's not what he promised them. And so we are seeing, for example, in this Republican primary survey, that those voters under 40 are starting to slip away from him in terms of favorability. And these are Republican primary voters. We'll see how this looks in the general election primary electorate, because I suspect the problems are going to be even bigger. And the irony is this is exactly what cost Joe Biden. He lost the young portion of his own party. I'm seeing similar signs in the Republican Party for Donald Trump. And, we'll see moving forward. But all indications I'm seeing on Donald Trump's job approval is that he is now in Biden territory.
So I want to return to something you said a second ago, which is that, this race is going to be decided on these economic issues, these gas price issues, which obviously people are hurting right now. But it's not as if the gas prices just jumped because they did. We're obviously in a foreign conflict right now. So, how is that I guess I'm a little confused how the foreign portion of things doesn't actually factor into this election, given that it's the whole reason why we have these higher gas prices in the first place right now.
Well, first of all, I think we need to separate out the Israel-Gaza conflict from the Iran conflict. The Israel-Gaza conflict is not at the top of voters' minds right now. It is at the top of a lot of Democratic activists' minds right now. But Iran is at the top of people's minds, but not because we're in conflict, because it's costing us so much, because gas prices are soaring. It's driving everything else up. One of the worst things I think Donald Trump did was to just dismiss the affordability argument, dismiss that costs were skyrocketing. Again, it's exactly what Joe Biden did. He's making the exact same mistakes Joe Biden made in dismissing voter concerns. So while Iran is absolutely playing into this conversation, it's playing into the conversation because of cost and the affordability crisis it's creating.
Richard, thank you very much for doing our program. Always great to have you on. Take care. Have a nice weekend. Our thanks to our panel, as always. Next week, more Off the Record right here.
Production of Off the Record is made possible in part by Bellwether Public Relations, a full-service strategic communications agency partnering with clients through public relations, digital marketing, and issue advocacy. Learn more at bellwetherpr.com. For more Off the Record, visit WKAR.org. Michigan public television stations have contributed to the production costs of Off the Record.